Okay. Ja,
Guten Abend.
guten Abend, Frau Feist. Ich möchte Sie erstmal ganz kurz bitten, dann jetzt die Mikros auszustellen. Sie können den Videobildschirm gerne anlassen, wenn Sie möchten, aber für eine verbesserte Audioqualität ist das immer von Vorteil, denn dann hören Sie unseren Autor und mich ein bisschen besser. Herzlich willkommen heute Abend hier im Stream, liebe Gäste. Herzlich willkommen zu einem Online-Event aus unserer Reihe Transatlantic Tuesdays. Mein Name ist René Freudenthal. Ich begleite Sie heute Abend für das Carl-Schurz-Haus durch unseren Abend mit Hari Kunzru, einem der intelligentesten und innovativsten Stimmen der englischsprachigen Gegenwartsliteratur, und seinem Roman Red Pill. Ja, worum geht es bei diesem Roman? Wer ist der Autor? Das sage ich Ihnen in ein ganz paar Sätzen, denn das Buch ist noch nicht auf Deutsch erschienen. Das können Sie also vielleicht noch gar nicht wissen. Deswegen hole ich das ganz kurz für Sie nach. Der Schöpfer des Roman-Superhits White Tears liefert in diesem Roman eine geniale Geschichte über die verzweifelte Suche nach Ordnung in einer Welt, die den Wahnsinn zur neuen Wahrheit erklärt hat und in alternativen Fakten untergeht. Das kennen Sie vielleicht noch. Berlin 2016. Für ein prestigeträchtiges Schreibstipendium am renommierten Deuter Zentrum kommt der Erzähler in Hari Kunzrus Red Pill, ein eher mittelmäßiger amerikanischer Schriftsteller, in den Berliner Vorort Wannsee und müht sich in der klaustrophobischen, kafkaesken Atmosphäre der Villa, in der diese Denkfabrik untergebracht ist, überhaupt irgendwas zu erreichen. Stattdessen an seinem Buch zu schreiben, um genau zu sein, unternimmt er lange Spaziergänge um den See, verschlingt ganze Staffeln einer fiktionalen Fernsehserie, einem Polizeidrama, das erschreckend prinzipienlos und extrem brutal ist und das ihn plötzlich eigenartig zu überzeugen scheint in der Weltsicht, die es anbietet. Wannsee ist ein Ort voller Geister. Am gegenüberliegenden Seeufer, ja, da steht die Villa, in der die Nazis die Endlösung planten. Zugleich besucht der Erzähler bei seinen Runden um den See das Grab von Heinrich von Kleist, der sich dort erschoss, weil ihm, das Zitat kennen Sie alle, auf Erden nicht zu helfen war. Zugleich streifen Flüchtlingsfamilien, die alles verloren haben, wie Gespenster der Moderne durch die nahen Wälder. Als ein Kollege am Deuter Zentrum ihn mit auf eine schicke Party in Berlin nimmt, auf der ausgerechnet Anton, dem dämonischen Schöpfer von Blue Lives, das ist der Name von dem Polizeidrama, das ich erwähnt hatte, begegnet, beginnt der Erzähler zu glauben, dass die beiden Männer in einen kosmischen Endkampf verwickelt sind, den schon die nordischen Mythen hervorgesagt haben. Anton verabreicht dem halt- und orientierungslosen Amerikaner die sprichwörtliche rote Pille, wie es in den Matrix-Filmen heißt, und zieht ihn hinab in die schwelende Unterwelt der Alt-Right-Bewegung, die sich in Internetforen an finsteren Verschwörungstheorien labt. Verliert der Erzähler seinen Verstand oder die halbe Menschheit? Ich verrate nur so viel, der Roman endet am Tag der US-Wahl 2016. Ganz kurz noch zum Autor selbst. Hari Kunzru schrieb unter anderem für die New York Times und den New Yorker, erhielt etliche Literaturpreise und Stipendien, beispielsweise von der Guggenheim Foundation, der New York Public Library und von der American Academy in Berlin. Im Rahmen dieses Aufenthalts entstand auch der Roman oder zumindest seine Grundlagen. Seine 5 Romane wurden in mindestens 21 Sprachen übersetzt. Er ist Host des wirklich ausgezeichneten Podcasts Into the Zone. Er wurde in London geboren und lebt inzwischen mit seiner Familie in Brooklyn in New York, wie sein Erzähler. Der heutige Abend, das habe ich schon kurz erwähnt, ist eine Veranstaltung im Rahmen der Reihe Transatlantic Tuesdays, a series of conversations, die wir nächsten Dienstag fortsetzen, dann mit der leitenden US-Redakteurin des New Statesman, Emily Temkin, und einem Gespräch über das jüdische Amerika. But for now, welcome Hari Kunzru. I'm delighted you're here.
Thank you for inviting me.
So I could start this conversation with the title of the novel, as many interviewers have done. Red pilling is a thing now. I don't know if you want to, I've tried to dive into it in the beginning in German for a bit, if you want to explain a little bit about it, but because this is basically the first event in Germany for the book, which is out in August at Liebeskind Verlag. I also want to talk about Germany in the beginning. if you can believe it, because much of Red Pill is set at Wannsee, where the grave of the suicidal poet Heinrich von Kleist and the mansion where the Nazis signed off on the final solution evoke a kind of like haunting scenery of German romanticism gone wrong. So there's like a famous speech by Thomas Mann, which I revisited in advance, where he explained where like the German romantic spirit, which is very deep in the national soul still, just soured and basically led to Nazism. So I was wondering, for you and in writing this novel, are the very modern kind of troubles of identity and politics your novel and your narrator explore in this novel also results of a kind of romanticism gone wrong, or is it like a repeat basically for you?
I think that's such an interesting question. To take the first part first, the question of red pill as an idea. I mean, you mentioned the film The Matrix, which was the origin of the story. The narrator, the hero of the film, is given a choice between a blue pill and a red pill. If he takes the blue pill, everything will stay the same and he will live his normal life. But if he takes the red pill, he'll see the truth of things. And in this science fiction film, the truth is a terrible dystopia. And then that idea of a sort of a moment of awakening where you would see the truth of things had circulated on the internet in various forms, but has become associated with, I suppose, ideological indoctrination into far right ideas and principles. The I mean, there are other pills now. I mean, people talk about the black pill as well, of a kind of nihilist point of view. But on the internet these days, if you are red pilled, it tends to mean that you no longer believe what you are told by what they term the mainstream media, and you feel that your views lie to the right of the kind of consensus space of mainstream discourse. And then, I mean, that is in itself, in some ways, a sort of romantic self conception, to be the person who's disabused, the person who knows the truth, where all around you, the mass, the herd, is is still asleep, is still at one point I considered using for the epigram for the novel some lines from the Winterreise, where he says, "Why should I remain among the sleepers?" He's and this idea of being the only one who is awake is clearly is something that is an inheritance from romanticism that has now become associated, maybe firstly through a kind of bohemian idea. The flaneur is the one who is in the crowd but is not of the crowd, is not part of the crowd, but now has become, I think, associated with what you could call a sort of far right bohemia which exists. And this development, this cultural development of this kind of culturally active far right is something that has taken place, I think, within the last decade, really. When I was younger, the extreme right really had a set of signs and symbols that were very stale. They were inherited from the mid 20th century in England, where I grew up. There was a skinhead movement, and their dress and their rhetoric was very alienating to most people. But what we've seen with the rise of the internet is the idea of I would say a much more vibrant far right politics. It seems terrible to use this word, but a very attractive they use humor, they use irony, they co-opt all sorts of cultural symbols, and many of them do present themselves in a way that I think owes a lot to the romantic tradition. I mean, on the cover of the American edition of the book, up by my head, you see that you can see behind the shape that's blocking it out is the famous Caspar David Friedrich painting, and the wanderer above the sea of fog. He is above the sea of fog. It's such a psychological image, and is of course a kind of cliche for the lone individual above the mass. But you see versions of this thought again and again amongst these far right figures who feel that they are the ones who have the truth and that they've awoken from some sort of sleep.
Yeah, actually, it's kind of interesting that we get right into this kind of internet culture phenomenon, which is of course at the heart of the book. But something that really struck a chord with me is, of course, it's kind of forward thinking in its evil ways. Basically, you called it vibrant. I would agree, but it's also nostalgic in a ironic and weird way. There's a point in the book where the narrator contemplates about, well, the way they're dressed now. You would think they're socially liberal, but it's not the case anymore. Like you cannot just assume that. And people adapt these kind of weird, ironic 30s styles again, which is a throwback of 80 years. And from there, they adapt like Nordic myths from thousands of years ago. So it's kind of weird that it's the cycle of recycling, basically. Cycle of recycling is interesting, actually. And not really something completely new. It's just a reframing. And what came to my mind when I revisited the novel in advance for this is actually, I'm sure you've heard of it or already watched it. The legendary BBC documentary maker Adam Curtis has a new series of documentaries out, Can't Get You Out of My Head, which is a emotional history of the 20th century, which is of course highly relevant to the novel in a way. And one of his strong theses is that the internet is not made to think of new things. It just recycles endlessly, and that's blocking our way of thinking in a very profound way, because it just keeps recycling stuff that's already in it. It's not built to come up with new stuff. Is that something you empathize with, or would you disagree?
It's so funny. I was just listening to him speak about this in an interview, and I have some disagreements with Adam Curtis, but I mean maybe they're not for this conversation. But I agree that there is an element of the internet, the idea of a recommendation, or if you like this, then you'll like that. This reinforcement of our previous choices. I think he's absolutely right to identify that as a potentially very toxic part of the internet culture. I mean, we in the US we have a lot of conversations, especially in the last few years, about what get called silos or bubbles. The idea that through this process of you like something, so the YouTube or some other place suggests more similar content, that you end up reinforcing and reinforcing a particular set of choices until you're almost trapped in your own world, a hall of mirrors, your own filter bubble, which may be completely different from the person next to you. And so there's a lot of anxious conversation about the breakdown of shared public space. And I have a little fun in the novel with that idea, in the institution that the main character is visiting is this foundation set up by a German industrialist, one of these kind of titans of the post-war period, who helped in the reconstruction of Germany. And he's very committed to this idea of openness. You'd say maybe a Habermasian idea of the public sphere, but this in itself becomes slightly oppressive, because the demand for openness and the demand for being visible at all times, certainly for this very grumpy, rather gloomy figure, he finds it terribly difficult to be in community, in a forced community. But at the same time, I mean, I am very concerned about the effect on politics of the breakdown of a shared public space. You know, if you and I cannot agree on what the basic facts are, then how can we come to any sort of agreement about how to proceed? And we end up prisoners of our own phantoms. We end up prisoners of our own previous choices, as Adam Curtis argues. And so I am interested in that aspect of the internet. I'm interested also in the way that the internet is this sort of machine for making global subcultures. I mean, I got online really relatively early. I mean, I think I had my first email in 1992, maybe. That sort of before the web really got going. And so I'm so old that I remember a time when there were less than 1,000 websites. But even then, it was exciting to me that I could have a little window into the very strange subcultural preoccupations of people who were geographically far from me. And so now, you know, for good and ill, everybody can find their community. You know, if you're, you know, if you collect, I don't know, you collect old soda cans, you can find everybody else who does that. But also, if you are interested in I don't know, Nazi occultism, then you can find your fellow Nazi occultists. And so people may be part of communities that have nothing to do with place, nothing to do with national identity, or the traditional dimensions around which people were bonded together have a supplement which may be much more important. So there's this invisible, intangible aspect to people's lives. It's as if people have a kind of secret information life that everybody carries around with them, and they can be part of quite peculiar, unusual things.
Yeah, but at the same time, yeah, it's very interesting. In one way, it suggests endless possibilities and the most random of niches and subcultures. And of course, it does just that. At the same time, the path your narrator goes through the internet and through the internet's figures that come into real life in the novel. Of course, Anton, I have already mentioned the main antagonist, if we might call it that, in a literary seminar. The one basically niche they pick out is basically what the narrator says, well, so the big secret is the age-old racism or what? Like there's this scene in the book, which is pretty climactic, where the story in the literary center has already gone wrong a little bit, and he meets up with Anton by accident, and then they go and eat a döner in a Berlin döner shop, and it sets up this kind of counter strike of ideologies, like milquetoast liberalism versus this do or die Nietzschean right-wing worldview of Anton, which has this glamour, this evil glamour in a way, which it's kind of, I don't know, which it kind of radiates off, I guess. But at the same time, the narrator is like really to the point when he says, well, what you got is just racism or what? So do you think there's a way to dismantle this kind of niche internet subculture sex appeal that this kind of ideology has developed? Because you said in the 90s it used to be pretty stale, and I mean that it's the same in Germany. Of course, we remember how Nazis looked in the 90s.
Yeah, I mean, I was just yesterday watching some uh, German far right people doing a cooking show. They had a these two guys in balaclavas doing vegan cookery, and so I mean, and they had some kind of, and they had this presentation that was much more sophisticated than their I don't know, their uncles and their older brothers back in the 90s. But I think it's important to say that these people don't have the monopoly on anything really. I mean, I believe that they were given a chance to grow because of a kind of complacency amongst I mean, I hate falling into this language, but let's say mainstream liberals, people with not terribly strong commitments politically, but who broadly believe in the version of the world put forward by, I don't know, the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung or the New York Times or whatever it would be. And there was a dissent from some of the terms. I mean, also, I think we have to say in material terms, the financial crisis of 2008 is very important in this. In that, for younger people in particular, the economic possibilities that were taken for granted by older people are just simply not there. And so the settlement was that if you believe in these things, we will give you broadly a good life, a comfortable life. And that's clearly not true, especially for a lot of younger Americans. I mean, they don't have secure jobs, they have no savings, they have no chance of owning a house, and so there's a massive discontent there, and people are breaking to the left or to the right. And the idea of a kind of witty, ironic debunking of the pompous mainstream liberal is a position that has given the right a lot of ammunition, I would say, and has allowed it's the kind of attractive position to inhabit for an angry young man or an angry young woman. And so I see people in their 20s who are often with very little historical understanding. They also feel that, especially for Americans, discovering things about European history can feel like they're possessors of secret knowledge, but that may be something to do with the American education system. um, but but there's no reason to leave this ground to them, and I think people on the left have also learned much better how to occupy that ground. I mean, in the import of the kind of aesthetics of German anti-fascism and anarchism and things like the squatters movements from the 1970s and 1980s. Some of the feel, if not all the politics, have come to the US, and that has given a kind of counter aesthetic to the extreme right. And so that, and then in the discourse here, there's this semi-mythical Antifa who are, the behind the lot. I mean, who seem to kind of play the same role as the International Jew did for the National Socialists of the 1930s. But there's a real war of ideas and a war that is happening on a cultural front here, quite apart from anything to do with sort of material proposals for changing people's lives. I mean, that war partly takes place on a kind of symbolic level about asserting different things about history and so on, but it's really, we've had the experience in the US of the invisible underground coming forth and sort of exploding into the mainstream consciousness. I mean, coming to the White House, really. Trump was a creature of the internet. Some of Trump's advisors, notably the young immigration policy advisor, Stephen Miller, who was responsible for the very extreme mistreatment of migrants at the southern border with Mexico. He's absolutely formed by this far right internet culture. His style, his of argument, everything is from this. And so it was the experience, I think, for a lot of people of something completely unexpected and unseen erupting into their everyday life.
Yeah, actually, I think that was one of my next questions, because this gives the novel such forward momentum, I think, because you can just feel, you can re-feel the last few years and their like emotional energy in politics. I mean, of course, it's much more extreme in America than it is for now in Germany, but we're always a few years behind. But there's this overarching theme in the novel of online culture basically collapsing into daily life and then into politics and political life of a whole nation. And so the clue is basically what starts as a paranoid fever dream, maybe by a person under certain kinds of stress, which are set up in the novel's general setup, I would say. They end in like a cataclysmic, seismic political event. I've already mentioned that the novel ends on election night of 2016, and that's in every review. So I think I'm not spoiling that, and we all know how the election went. But it's actually kind of interesting, especially as a German, because it gets one to thinking about how naive we were for many, many years in thinking about online culture as something completely separate from daily life, even though everybody stares into screens for 10 years now or longer, you for 20. It's just like, there's even this German word like Netzkultur, which we try to applicate to a certain kind of culture, which can be put into a different region of cultural, basically looking at culture. And that's the not really serious part, and everything else is the serious part. And before we even got to like a middle stage, it reached politics in the US in such a monumental way. And I was thinking, you've already mentioned you've been an early adapter at the internet, you worked at Wired in the 90s. So you've been there from the beginning, basically. And did you feel that coming from before the turn of the century even, or is that something that's really something of the last 10 years?
I think my first understanding that something could affect mainstream political culture came probably maybe about 15 years ago, when an activist friend of mine sent me some screenshots of a strange internet event that at the time there was a little virtual world that was aimed at teenagers called Habbo Hotel, and some people had made accounts on this little, it was a sort of, there are little rooms and you could make a character, an avatar, and you could dress the character in various ways, and they had all made the same avatar of a person who looked a little like Samuel Jackson in the Pulp Fiction, so a big afro and a suit and dark skin, and they had gone into this space and they stood in a shape of a Hakenkreuz, in a swastika shape, blocking the exits, and every time anybody asked to leave, because the kids were kind of trapped in the room, they would say various sort of racist things, and there was a sort of punchline, a racist punchline that they would say that I won't repeat, and it was just a strange thing, and I wondered how it had been organized and who would do such a thing, and I found it had been organized on a site called 4chan, an image board, and in the intervening 15 years, this particular board became a kind of petri dish for some very extreme subcultural behavior, and eventually a recruiting ground for the far right. This was a sort of basically kind of teenagers trying to shock, and they were white suburban American boys playing with imagery. What's the most kind of shocking thing that they could do, the most calculated to upset people? Well, that was it. And they, over the years, the irony fell away, and they made content. I mean, interestingly, apparently they actually once did a similar raid on a board called Stormfront, which was actually a neo-Nazi board, and because they successfully disrupted Stormfront, the Stormfront serious neo-Nazis became interested in 4chan and realized that it was a recruiting ground, and so they joined. So there was a sort of fusion between those cultures, and what started off as an ironic joke gradually became more serious. But I spent some time on this board in the mid 2000s, and it was kind of disgusting, but at the same time kind of compelling. You could see that there was a sort of arms race of humor, of gross out humor that was being perpetrated there. I mean, and also very disturbing things like people would pretend or actually plan school shootings. I mean, I saw people posting pictures of bombs and things like that. So that it was a very wild and extreme part of the internet. And then it's that culture that kind of arose. So I suppose I had some early warnings 15 years ago, but I didn't realize how big it would grow. I mean, the 15-year-olds of 15 years ago are grown up, politically active members of the far right now. And I think that your point about Netzkultur being a kind of separate sphere, and everybody being content to imagine that it was something with its own rules that had no real impact on the rest of the world. That was, I think, very much the 90s and maybe early 2000s complacent picture. And now we know there's just culture. All culture takes place on the internet to some extent, especially now during the pandemic. Here we all are. We're all on the internet. So I think it's that separation is collapsed, and now we have to understand how ideas spread, how almost like how feelings. I mean, you talked about Adam Curtis and a history of emotion, and I think there are a lot of aspects of this extremist culture that don't depend on logic and argument, but depend on generating a certain kind of emotion and a certain kind of feeling, whether that's nostalgia, a feeling of sadness for the great old days of Europe or whiteness or whatever it would be. America, making America great again is the slogan. The idea of loss is in that thought. So there has been a fall, and we'll go back to the garden, we'll go back to Eden, and these things we need to study in their native environment, I suppose.
It's kind of interesting that you mentioned the slogan, because I was just thinking about I mean, we have all forgotten about Donald Trump, obviously, but the slogan is still there: make America great again. It might yet come back, because there's never a time not to make it great again, of course. But it's interesting that they can never quite pinpoint the year to which they want to go back to. And I was thinking about it because a journalist from Germany asked the main leader of the Alternative for Deutschland, so our far-right party, of course, about where they would like to go back to. And he was a bit stunned, because they want to make Germany great again, obviously, too. And to everybody's surprise, he didn't pick 1939, but 2005, which is like the last year before Angela Merkel came to power. And I was thinking, well, that was actually the last year of a red-green social democrat government with record unemployment. And it's really an unlikely year to pick, but I think there's this
it shows how dangerous if you actually pin someone down about that nostalgia. I mean, they don't have a year, really. It's a ridiculous answer. 2005 is a ridiculous answer.
Yeah, I think that's what I took from it too. So before we hear a little bit from the beginning of the novel by Hari Kunzru, who's going to read a few pages from the very beginning, which is about middle age, middle life a little bit. It's an absolutely brilliant gut punch, as you will experience in just a few minutes. But I wanted to ask before that about the relationship between middle age, a middle life crisis maybe, which the narrator is definitely going through. He has this fellowship at the Deuter Center in Berlin. He goes there, he doesn't do much. He gets into one existential crisis after another. And he feels his life like losing options, losing potential, I think, in a way. And the very ending of the novel, as I've mentioned, is the 2016 election. And I was thinking after reading it, is this maybe kind of like America's middle life crisis? Because, I mean, compared to Britain, for example, where you grew up, it's not a very old kind of country in a way. I mean, it's barely 200 years old. So maybe America went straight from puberty to middle life crisis. Would you say that might be possible?
I mean, I maybe even childhood to midlife crisis. I mean, I mean, it's very, you know, as everybody knows, there's a cultural preference in America for looking to the future. The idea of the frontier dominated American thought for many generations. And firstly, the frontier was the move westwards, and then maybe perhaps it was the move into space or something like that. But now but I mean, very important for America is also the idea of innocence, and it sees itself as an innocent country, I think, or it wishes to see itself as an innocent country. It was, you know, it was a refuge from the religious troubles of old Europe for the Protestant dissenters who went to the New World. And obviously, there's a huge problem with that, in that there were already people there, and genocide was committed against them. And I suppose the second great sin would be the sin of slavery. So there is no innocence, and the maintenance of white innocence in America is it's almost like the dominant block to a real self-knowledge, let's say. So yeah, I mean, and certainly, I mean, a lot of that has been collapsed in the last few years, and the feeling is unpleasant for a lot of people, especially a lot of comfortably situated white people. And they resent having to think about the past, and they resent having to think about themselves in a negative way. So yeah, I mean, maybe it's a bitter middle age that has come straight after childhood, a very terrible thing for a country to have to endure. But I'll read the opening of the novel, and yeah, actually, I mean, I showed the American cover. Here's another cover for the book, which you have too, which is Heinrich von Kleist with laser eyes, like often far right people use in their avatars. So he's a kind of internet Kleist. I think it's possible to track the onset of middle age exactly. It's the moment when you examine your life, and instead of a field of possibility opening out, an increase in scope, you have a sense of waking up from sleep or being washed up on shore, newly conscious of your surroundings. So this is where I am, you say to yourself. This is what I've become. It's when you first understand that your condition, physically, intellectually, socially, financially, is not absolutely mutable, that what has already happened will, to a great extent, determine the rest of the story. What you've done cannot be undone, and much of what you've been putting off for later will never get done at all. In short, your time is a finite and dwindling resource. From this moment on, whatever you're doing, whatever joy or intensity or whirl of pleasure you may experience, you'll never shake the almost imperceptible sensation that you're travelling on a gentle downward slope into darkness. For me, this realization of mortality took place, conventionally enough, beside my sleeping wife at home in our apartment in Brooklyn. As I lay awake, listening to her breathing, I knew that my strength and ingenuity had their limits. I could foresee a time when I would need to rest. How I'd got there was a source of amazement to me, the chain of events that had led me to that slightly overheated bedroom, to a woman who, had things turned out differently, I might never have met or recognized as the person I wanted to spend my life with. After 5 years of marriage, I was still in love with Ray, and she was still in love with me. All that was settled, a happy fact. Our 3-year-old daughter was asleep in the next room. Our very happiness made me uneasy. It was a perverse reaction, I knew. I was like a miser fretting about his emotional hoard. Yet the mental rats running round my bedroom, round my child's bedroom, had something real behind them. It was a time when the media was full of images of children hurt and displaced by war. I frequently found myself hunched over my laptop, my eyes welling with tears. I was distressed by what I saw, but also haunted by a more selfish question. If the world changed, would I be able to protect my family? Could I scale the fence with my little girl on my shoulders? Would I be able to keep hold of my wife's hand as the rubber boat overturned? Our life together was fragile. One day something would break. One of us would have an accident, one of us would fall sick, or else the world would slide further into war and chaos, engulfing us as it had so many other families. In most respects, I had little to complain about. I lived in one of the great cities of the world. Save for a few minor ailments, I was physically healthy, and I was loved, which protected me from some of the more destructive consequences of a so-called midlife crisis. I had friends who, without warning, embarked on absurd sexual affairs, or in one case developed a ruinous crack habit that he kept hidden from everyone until he was arrested at 3 a.m. in Elizabeth, New Jersey, smoking behind the wheel of his parked car. I was not about to fuck the nanny or gamble away our savings, but at the same time I knew there was something profoundly but subtly wrong, some urgent question I had to answer that concerned me in isolation and couldn't be solved by waking Ray or going on the internet or padding barefoot into the bathroom and swallowing a sleeping pill. It concerned the foundation for things, beliefs I'd spent much of my life writing and thinking about, the various claims I made for myself in the world. And coincidentally or not, it arrived at a time when I was about to go away. One reason I was awake, worrying about money and climate change and Macedonian border guards, was that an airport transfer was booked for 5 in the morning. I never sleep well on the night before I have to travel. I'm always nervous that I'll oversleep and miss my plane.
Thank you so much. I think we're all clapping in our heads. It's not possible to clap on Zoom without making a mayhem out of it. So before I pose my 2 last questions, oh, there's someone clapping via emoji, so that's very nice as well. I want to encourage everybody who hasn't done that yet, but wants to pose a few audience questions in the chat, either to me as a private message or to Alle, to everybody, like Gwyneth has already done. I'm going to pick a few for the very end of this, and then you will get a chance to also get your questions about the book answered. But I wanted to pick up from the reading part to a line of your description of your podcast, Into the Zone, actually, which is very connected to the book in a way, I think. And in the copy for the podcast, it says, borders are never as clear as we think. I think that's one of the leitmotifs, basically, of the podcast, which is very, very, very good. And I would recommend it to everybody listening. And I was thinking about in how many ways this applies to the book as well. This kind of weakening of inner borders in a way, and things falling apart. The center cannot hold is, of course, like the famous line quoted to death by now. And how this also kind of applies to the culture at the Deuter Center, which you already mentioned, this kind of forced total transparency, and you should bear yourself to the outside world at all times. And that's connected to the inner life, which the Romantics cherished. Of course, you should have a rich inner life. And now the culture of total transparency wants you to put this into the outside world in a way. And so there you have one weakening border, and that can lead to a whole identity, I think, crumbling in some ways. And I was wondering if you think this is something that we're just more aware of now, because it's in culture all around us, and we think about it more because it's a topic on the internet, changing identities, fragmenting identities, or if it's really something new.
I think that's such an interesting question and such a hard one. I mean, I've been just today actually trying to write something about attention and you know, a lot of people are claiming that the internet is in some way destroying our capacity to focus deeply on a single thing, and I'm skeptical of that claim. But I think one thing that seems very important about what gets now called surveillance capitalism is that the traces of ourselves and of our choices that we leave, as that we sort of trail behind us as we go about our lives, those have value and economic value, and as they become kind of collected and analyzed and in a way codified, I mean, they make a sort of uh they I mean, you could call it a grammar maybe, or you could call it a sort of set of channels through which we're encouraged to sort of experience ourselves. I mean, I do think that these internet companies are now very deeply embedded in our sense of self, and one of the concerns of Red Pill is privacy and surveillance, as you mentioned. The idea of the inner life and the importance of that for the Romantics was also that it was a very untouchable place. It was the source of you know of Geist, of something profound about what it was to be a human. Um, and certainly our space of privacy has shrunk. I mean, we now carry little surveillance devices around with us all the time, and at least potentially at all times, we can be watched or listened to. And we know that. Even, I mean, I'm always amazed that people have these smart speakers in their homes, which, you know, which are always on listening to your conversation, since the whole idea seems terrifying to me. But there we are. But we have this sense that the things that we think privately may be exposed before we want them to be. I mean, we, you know, and the kind of consequences for certain sorts of public shaming and so on are there. And so I think we are, in some ways, we're much more restricted in our imaginations, and our sense of ourselves is so meshed in. We are encouraged to think of ourselves in terms of likes and shares and a certain kind of visibility. I've heard it called an ontology of visibility. You have more being if you are more visible in this culture. Um, all these things are potentially qualitatively new. I mean, I'm cautious about saying that because I think there's a lot of moral panic around, you know, oh no, the internet is destroying our brains. I don't think it is in a straightforward way, but we are. I think our sense of social versus individual and our sense of private versus public is being reconfigured at the moment.
Yeah. Um, Before I want to pose my very last question, which is a bit of a mean one, I just want to warn you, but I hope an interesting one. I cannot let the character of Anton go, and I think we talked not enough about him because he's such an interesting character to make up in a way. He's part Steve Bannon, of course, but he dresses better and washes more, I would say. He has elements, I think, of I kept thinking in this way of arguing, he's a little bit like Leviathan by Thomas Hobbes. He has like this strain of uh, everything is allowed for one overarching goal in society, basically, and you have to submit to it or you'll die. A very different kind of politics than we're used to. um, and he's also a weird kind of like he's a Hollywood guy in a way, which feels very disconcerting because he's a maker of mainstream pop culture. I've mentioned Blue Lives, this brilliantly titled TV show he's using to get into people's brains. I was wondering actually, how did he come into your brain? Did you watch a very bad cop show somewhere?
Well, I had a message the other day from the showrunner of quite a famous American cop show called The Shield. He's saying, "Is this supposed to be me?" And I had to assure him that it really wasn't intended to be him, though the plot of Blue Lives has some similarities to this show. But I mean, as you said, the interest is that is the is the idea that somebody who has access to the mainstream kind of dream machine also is using that as a kind of tool of subversion. I mean, that's an idea that's been a kind of maybe a more sort of left fantasy than a right fantasy. And this, you know, he's a composite of various kinds of cultural figures. You know, the as you mentioned Bannon, I mean, there are other kind of younger, maybe sort of hipper far right activists. There are also various people in TV and media and tech who have expressed a fascination with this kind of politics and who have some kind of level of cultural power. But for me, I wanted to make an attractive devil. I wanted to make a figure who would make a strong case for this indefensible politics, and it does come down to a question. You know, you mentioned Thomas Hobbes, and you know the phrase that people associate with him is that, you know, life is nasty, brutish, and short, and the a central plank of a lot of this far right thinking is that what is wrong with liberalism and left thinking is that it doesn't have a correct view of human nature. It has an overly optimistic view of human nature, or that it wants in some way to perfect humans in order to make them fit with a political system better. And so for the red pilled rightist, you know, he is the person who understands how grim and, you know, nasty, brutish, and short the world, you know, the life of humans really is, and fits a politics that accepts that. But it's a politics that kind of believes that power is everything, and power is a kind of fact. You know, the powerful, there's no reason for the powerful to defer to the weak because they're powerful, and that's just how it is. And it's probably just or correct in some way that they exercise their power to the fullest, and they see the other kind of politics as basically being, you know, the politics of the herd, the politics of the weak, the you know, slave morality, these kinds of Nietzschean ideas that can be twisted in a certain way to justify established power. You know, and also the kind of older ancien regime ideas of, you know, God put you in charge, therefore your kingship is just. All these ideas float around and are being kind of refloated as a way to attack representative democracy. So there's a soup of ideas on the far right that come from various different places. But I am digressing. I could go on for a long time about this.
Yeah, I would like to listen to it maybe as a podcast. So my already announced last question, I think it's not that evil though, is because I assumed that you wrote the novel with the thought in mind already that it would end on election night 2016. I was wondering if something fundamental about the novel would change if you wrote it now and it would end either at the outbreak of COVID or on the day of the storming of the Capitol.
Well, I mean, the book was started before 2016. The book started in 20. Or I started writing in 2015, and I resisted the kind of easy frame of Trump's election for as long as I could, because but then it seemed to me also that it is a story about certain quite. I mean, the narrator is a fairly complacent person in some ways, and the eruption of this world into his world was symbolized by that election victory. You have, you know, for many people here, it was impossible that Trump could become president. He's a cartoon figure. He's a reality TV show host, and of course he did. And that was an existentially challenging thing. Inevitably, you know, I am writing another novel, and I've been writing that through the pandemic, and inevitably that's become a novel of the time of the pandemic. I mean, it's not, you know, about the pandemic but it just, you know, it naturally has taken the distance that we have from each other, and just the strange sort of social routines that we have, you know, that's found its way in. So I think a novel is always a kind of I don't know, a bag into which a writer puts the things that are happening to them at the time, and it's inevitably the world you're writing in finds its way into your writing, even if you're trying to stop it.
Yeah. So I would like to pose Gwyneth's question to you. I'm very proud of myself that I didn't say Gwyneth, but Gwyneth, who thanks you for the fascinating talk, is a fellow escapee from Essex, but to Berlin, actually. And she would like to ask you what you think about the possibilities of the interactive novel and digital storytelling in general. For example, Black Mirror, or the recent work published online by the brother of a victim of the Manchester Arena bombing. Is this something you'd be open to exploring, or do you prefer to think and work on the page?
Hi, fellow Essex person. You know, you mentioned that I used to work for Wired in the 90s, and I was I explored a lot of the possibilities of what used to be called hypertext then. And you know, there's some interesting things that happen to fiction, or to narrative, when rather than a single kind of arc, you have a branching, forking paths that you can take. And actually, I think you as you go into that idea and into that thought, you end up with games where we have an incredibly, you know, vast game culture these days, and it's and those experiences of playing games and being in game worlds are meaningful to people. But I pulled back from that kind of multiple choice model of doing narrative, because I found it unsatisfactory as a writer, sort of, and a reader, really. I have explored other ways of doing narrative, and slightly got burned by one aspect of the internet culture in the process. I made a non-fiction piece called Twice Upon a Time that took as its starting point the life of a street musician in New York called Moondog, who is an actual figure who was around in the 1960s and 70s, a man who dressed as a Viking and stood on a corner playing homemade instruments. And I used that as a kind of metaphor for a lot of things about coming to a new city. And that was a piece that used sound and images and text, and was presented as a sort of app that, you know, you as you turned a page, different kind of elements came forward. But then the company that made it went bust, and immediately the tech platform on which it was built vanished, and so it's no longer possible for anybody to experience it and see it. So there's a question of, I mean, the question of digital archiving is a very interesting one. I mean, how do we understand all this culture? Twitter has just said that it won't make Donald Trump's old tweets available, and even though those old tweets were in many ways reprehensible and terrible, they are also part of the historical record and for understanding what actually happened to us back there. And it seems worrying that that something that was a president's primary means of communication to the public could be not archived in that way.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, Gwyneth also is proud of me for pronouncing her name right, so that gives me little bit of joy in the evening. There's our director in the audience saying she also guessed it was the shield that's blue lies in the novel. Um,
It's not the shield, and I do need to say this because it really is not the shield in a straightforward way. But I was a fan of the shield, and I guess some of that has crept in.
And as a last question, the honor goes to Christina, who also thanks Hari very much for this inspiring talk and for your novels. She is a teacher of English at the high school level, and she would like to know what your advice would be to young adult readers, what to read and how to read. Wow, that's a great question.
Oh, that's a that's a big. I mean, my my parents, when I was a teenager, my parents were very worried about me because I read, I think age 13, I read nothing but science fiction. And you know, my all I would read were old science fiction paperbacks, and they went to my teachers and said, "Is that, you know, should we be encouraging him to read something else?" And my teacher sensibly said, "Well, he's reading a lot, and eventually he will find other things," and that's completely true. I mean, I'm having the same experience with my 8-year-old son at the moment. Is that, you know, it's exciting to me that he wants to read, and that's less important what it is right now than the fact that he's eagerly picking up books. Um, I mean, I haven't got particular titles to recommend because I don't know what. No, I mean, I read strange things when I was at high school. After my science fiction period went into a strange 1960s thriller period, like, but yeah, I would say it's, you know, the fact, if you can get them to read at all, that's the foundation of everything, and eventually people will find their way to more interesting and challenging material.
Thank you. I hope Christina has got a little bit of inspiration. And I would like to thank everybody who tuned in tonight. Oh, Gwyneth, thanks you also for your very comprehensive answer. Completely agree. Not to, yeah, well, complete agreement there. um, Along with the text, thank you so much, everybody, for tuning in tonight. As I've mentioned, we are doing another Transatlantic Tuesday next week, which I am talking actually to Emily Temkin of The New Statesman, the US editor of the magazine, about Jewish America, the future of Jewish America. Wenn es Ihnen gefallen hat, das sage ich kurz auf Deutsch, können Sie sich gerne mit einem Unkostenbeitrag von 5 Euro beteiligen, der uns ein bisschen auch über die Corona-Zeiten trägt. Die Angaben dazu finden Sie in der Mail, aus der Sie diesen Link haben. And with that, I want to thank first and foremost Hari Kunzru. It's been a true delight to have you here. I would recommend the book to everybody, of course. The local bookshop Jos Fritz has it on stock. The German translation, for everybody who wants to wait for that, is out in August by Liebeskind and can be bought then. So thank you so much, Hari.
And thank you, Renee, for a really enjoyable conversation. And thank you, everybody, for coming to listen.
Good night, everybody. Thank you.
Good night.